So let's start the session. So make sure that you have the, the high-level scope document, usually the statement of work or the business case document, so that you have a point of reference. You can figure out these are these 10, 20, or 15 requirements that we'll have to capture into detailed requirements, and you clearly know the key people who are your SMEs, who give you the requirements and who would approve it, right? You have all those templates as well, like traceability, the tools that you're going to use for elicitation, and all those would come in as inputs. And then you would start on to the requirement elicitation process. There is no tangible deliverable coming out of it because it's tightly coupled to the requirements documentation chapter, which is the next one, right? We'll cover how to document the requirements as part of the next phase, next chapter, right? So chapter 4 would primarily deal with how to document our requirements, and chapter 3, the one what we are talking about now, would cover about how to understand the requirements. Okay. Now, broadly, there are 10 ways in which you would engage a customer to understand the requirements. Okay. So we'll start with document analysis, interviews, observations, right? Then you have prototyping, and then you have group techniques like focus group, brainstorming, workshops. You do reverse engineering, you do interface analysis, you do the surveys and questionnaires, right? So these are the 10 ways. So the next 2-3 sessions would focus on how understanding these various techniques and how to engage the SMEs in these techniques to understand the requirements in detail. Okay. Now, yeah. So let's spend some time on understanding where do we start our requirements, right? So what's the first thing that you should do when you get into your requirements, right? Are we going to say, you'll go to the SME and then say, okay, start explaining about the requirement, first requirement, right? Or where exactly are you going to start, right? Let's take this, same example what we generally take, the mobile banking app. Now, where do you start? Are you going to directly, go and then say, okay, ask the SME, tell me each and every detailed requirement and then I'll document it? Not really. You're not going to be dependent on the SME completely for your requirements, right? Now, the first step I would strongly recommend is read some documents, okay? Now, there is enough information which you can gather, by reading some documents, right? A lot of this information is even available on the public websites. Like, if I just Google for mobile banking, right? I could get what all functionality does it offer, right? I can get that high level information about mobile banking and what all it does by just reading through Google, right? Now, there are enough documents available within the organization and outside in the on the internet, right, which you can refer to get that base understanding of the requirements, right? So why do we need to do that? Because it helps us to get that basic minimum knowledge. So you don't want to be like you don't want to be in a situation wherein you go to the SME and then say, I don't know anything, start telling me the requirements now, right? It will portray you in a very bad shape, right? So nobody wants to deal with a person who absolutely has nothing, no knowledge, and he's dependent on you completely for your requirements, right? So it always makes sense to go prepared for these interviews or your discussions with the SMEs, right? And reading through these documents is the first step towards that, right? So there are a lot of documents within your organization and outside on the internet which you can figure out to understand the requirement. The first level of detail. I'm not saying the complete requirement is available on the internet, but the first level of detail you can definitely get it from there, right? So refer to those documents. Make sure that you understand those you search for those documents and get those high-level details, and then read through those documents to get that first level of understanding. Some documents which would help you, the first set of documents which you definitely read is the SOW, maybe your RFP response if there was a competitive bidding, a business case if there was a business case document which was prepared. So these are some of the documents which you definitely read. Okay. Then, some of the documents are very contextual. Like, if there is an existing process within an organization, right? Like, maybe some guidelines regarding a credit analysis, right? So there would be some, standard operating procedure within the organization. This is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you have to do, right? So there would be standard operating procedures, guidelines, then the procedure documents, the manuals, which you can read, which are available within the organization to understand that specific process, right? So wherever the projects are that kind where they are mostly internal, you want to understand the internal process, ask for these process documents. Okay, so you can always ask for those documents and get that first level of understanding, rather than completely depending on the SME for the detailed requirement, right? So for some of the projects, it could be like you could get it from your competitors, right? Like a mobile banking application is a good one, right? So you can figure out what each one of those banks are doing, right? So you have so many mobile banking applications available. You can check out their websites, figure out what all functionalities are available in their in the competitors' products, or you could look out for analyst reports and then see what all they are offering, right? So you get that basic understanding about that features, the first level of details, by reading some documents, by checking out your competitor reviews, or figuring it out on the internet, right? There are multiple sources. You don't have to depend completely on the SME for explaining you the detailed requirements, right? Now, this document analysis or reading through some documents would help you get that first level of knowledge. So this is not going to give you the detailed requirement. It gets to a stage where you can start conversing with the SME. You'll get that minimum basic knowledge which is required on that particular domain topic of the project. Okay, so there could be some topics like maybe the example what I was taking about was about a a fraud anti-fraud system. Right now, for banks, right now there are so many details documents available on the internet. You can read through and then figure out what kind of fraud prevention, what kind of solutions, what kind of features they offer, right? So step 1, read stuff. Okay, so there are enough information on the internet, there are enough information within the organization, across your competitors, across the regulators. A lot of systems would have to generate some reports or some documents for the regulatory requirements, right? So they are available on the regulatory websites. Like banks, you always have this Fed which will ask for some kind of reports, right? So you can figure out all those regulatory requirements, figure out who are the sources, and then check their websites for what kind of requirements or what kind of reports they would ask for this particular requirement, and cover that. So that's the first step you would do. You would read some documents and understand that first level of knowledge. Then what? Right? So you gain that basic understanding. You fairly have an understanding, broad picture that this is what is this requirement about. But you still don't really have the specifics. How exactly the screen should look like, what details we should capture, what is mandatory, what is optional, what should be the alternate flows, right? A lot of details are missing out in this process, right? Now, those level of details you will go for your interviews, right? So interview is nothing but a one-on-one discussion with your subject matter experts. So you're having those discussions, you're asking questions, the SMEs are responding, and you're noting down those responses. right? So that's exactly is what you're doing in interview. Interviews again are broadly of two types. One is structured and the second one is unstructured interviews. Unstructured interview means you're generally going unprepared for the interview. So you don't have the list of questions that you want to ask. Okay. Now generally you do that maybe in the first 1-2 sessions to understand what is in scope, and the high level details. Right. Otherwise, most of your interviews should be structured interviews, which means once you have the requirement, you should clearly list down the list of questions. Right. You first gain that high level in knowledge by reading some documents and going through the internet or some space, figuring it out what is the process about, and then prepare the list of questions that you want to ask to gain that specific knowledge, right? So I'll help you with one framework which will help you, document all those kind of questions, how to arrive at what kind of questions to ask, right? And how to be pretty much sure that you are clear with the requirement, right? So let's spend some time towards that, and then we'll see, right? Yeah, but before that, you guys clearly understand the document analysis, what kind of documents are available, in what context, and what level of detail we get through the document analysis. So is that process clear? Right? It's quite simple. There's nothing too complicated in it. You figure out for some documents and read through that. Right? So that's all what you're doing. Okay? So that's the first step. You read through some documents which are available. And gain that first level of knowledge. Right? So you're not completely going to depend on the SME. You read some documents on your own and capture these details. Okay. So post that, what you would do is you would right. So you would spend some time with the SMEs, asking them questions and then capturing their responses. Right? Most of the time you go prepared for your interviews. Right? So I'll give you a broad framework on which you should list down what kind of questions to ask. Right? So one is basically the flow. Right? So you need to clearly identify what is the sequence of steps. Right? So figure out the process flow. Right? What is the step-by-step process to do this? So that's the first thing that you would capture. Okay. Now, if you take up any requirement, like let's say your mobile banking application, you want to do a funds transfer. So what is the step-by-step process? So that's your primary flow or the process flow in which you would do. Right? So this is something which you should clearly try to understand as part of your interview, right? And as part of this flow, you need to figure out, what is the sequence of steps that you need to perform, and what if the user misses out of any or enters an incorrect detail or selects a wrong option. So what kind of error messages you should display. So all those details also should be captured, right? So broadly, you're helping the the user of the system list down the sequence of steps that he has to perform, and in case something is incorrectly entered, then what is the error message that you have to display. Right? So that's what you're doing. You're trying to understand. Right? So focus on that particular process flow for that requirement. Like example, if you have a funds transfer, right? So what is the first step that you would do, right? And then the next step that you would do, what kind of information that you would capture, or what if some information is not available, then what kind of error messages you should display. If some validations fail, what kind of error messages you should display. So list down those questions, right? So understand the process flow for each of those deviations, figure out what are all the alternate flows, right? And then also check, are there any prerequisites or preconditions before you can. So you'll focus on the the flow, the primary flows, and then the alternate flows. You'll focus on the prerequisites or some conditions that should be satisfied before you get into a requirement. For example, before you could do a funds transfer, maybe you should log in into the system. You should have some funds in your account. So these are some of the five before you can even start that requirement, right? So figure out those prerequisites, right? So figure out those follow-up activities, like some maybe notifications, right? And then emails that you want to generate, right? Or some reporting that you want to do, right? All follow-up activities that you should do after your functionality is over. So maybe like if you take the funds transfer example, right? Maybe you should send out an SMS to the customer just to make sure that somebody has not exploited his mobile phone or something. You send out an SMS. You could also create an audit log. You could send out an email. So there are a lot of things that you want to do. You'll have to check with the customer what kind of notifications, reporting, audit logs that you'll have to prepare. Right? So that's another set of information that you could ask. Right? So what happens if the system breaks down? Let's say you're transferring some funds, and then there is the application crashed. So what should you do, right? So capture those exceptions as well, right? So these are some of those indications which will help you to frame your questions, right? So check on those process flows, check on those entry criteria, prerequisites or preconditions. Check out for those notifications, right? Check out for those exceptions when something breaks down, right? Or something is not functioning correctly. Like there is an you're transferring funds and then suddenly the internet is off, or maybe the application crashed. So how would you continue from there, right? All those exceptions have to be clearly captured. So broad guidelines to ask those kind of questions, right? So what kind of questions you should think about each process, and then you could look at each one of them and then capture these details, right? So these are some indications on what kind of questions to ask. So this way you are leading the requirements. So you're not completely dependent on the SME to tell you the comprehensive requirements, right? So if you figure out these 5 things, that these are the 5 things that I'll ensure that I'll ask, you can be pretty much sure that your requirement is comprehensive. Okay, I'll take a very small example and then let's go through this process. Right now, everybody understands this functionality about login. Right, so you have a screen, you have a user ID, you would have to enter password, and then you click on submit. There'll be maybe a reset button as well. Right, so user ID, password. Right, so you might think that this is a very simple example, right? So we don't even need to capture the detailed requirements or have a discussion with the customer to understand the requirements for this, right? But even the SME would feel like that, right? So what is there in this login functionality? It's a very simple one. You enter user ID, password, and then you log into the system, right? But let's go through this framework, right? And then see, have we collected all those information, or what kind of questions you could ask, right? So the primary flow, you will enter the user ID, password, and then click on submit. You would complete the check. I think more or less we can ask this question: what are the series of steps that you want to perform, for this login functionality, right? So you'll get that primary flow. First question will be, give me the list of steps or the process flow for this particular requirement logging into, right? Then you'll figure out the alternative requirements, right? So let's call this as 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So alternative flows would be, what if the user enters an incorrect user ID? Right? So this is an alternate flow. Maybe you'll have to display a message saying that your user ID is incorrect. Please check it. Or what if the user ID and if the user enters an incorrect password, right? So this is the second question on alternate flows, right? So should you ask the user? You should ask the user, what if the password is incorrect? What should you do, right? So you should display a message that saying that your password is incorrect. Please try again. Try again, right? So do you want to bring in a security mechanism that after 3 unsuccessful logins, you want to block the user ID, right? So, unless you ask these questions, those requirements would not come out, right? Or what happens if you forget your password? How would you retrieve it, right? So even before getting into the requirements, I'm having these questions. Why? Because, I can actually at a high level think through the process and then figure out what kind of questions. So broadly look at this framework. Focus on your primary flow, your alternate flow, right? Alternate flow, you can figure out each step. What if something is missing? What should we do? So this will help out to, capture the requirement. So, you'll figure out about your alternate flows. All right. Then you'll ask questions regarding, are there any prerequisites or something which should have been completed before we even start this requirement, right? So before even logging in, should you do something? Should you check out whether something is already there? Maybe he should register first, right? He should be an active user. He should not have been blocked, or his user ID should not have been blocked because his password is compromised or something like that, right? So that I need to perform these checks before I log in, right? So you're getting those preconditions. Then you also figure out is there any notifications or anything that I have to mention, right? Maybe you have to do your audit log that this user logged in at this particular time, right? No report needs to be generated, nothing for this requirement, but update your audit log. Okay. Then what if your system is down, right? So maybe the network is down and you're not able to contact your server, authentication server. So you have to display that you're not able to log in into your system. So please try again after some time, something like that. So your exception flows, you're figuring it out, right? A broad framework which will help out list down those questions, right? So we also this is also called as a use case narrative. When we get into the use case requirement, we'll understand this in much more detail. But it gives you an excellent framework to ask those right kind of questions, right? So whenever you go for those one-on-one discussions, broadly have this at the back of your mind. First, try to understand the process flow. Then figure out, what if some deviations happen, if the user enters the incorrect information or selects a different option. So for each of those steps, you have to evaluate and then see, can something go wrong at this step? In that situation, how should the system respond? Right? So each of those would result into a question, and then you would capture the details. Then you will figure out, are there any prerequisites before you start this requirement? Right? Like, you should be a registered user, you should be an active user, and all that stuff would come out. Right? Then any notifications or anything that you want to do after you log in into the system, right? Or maybe an unsuccessful attempt has been made, right? So maybe you should update your audit logs. So that's the only thing that you want to say here, right? And finally, your exception flows. When something goes wrong, what should you do, right? So that comes out as your exception flows. Okay. So use this framework to prepare for those questions, right? So a typical, time I would suggest, if you're planning for like half an hour or 1 hour interview session, make sure that you spend at least that half an hour, 1 hour slot to prepare your questions before you even go and meet the customer, right? So upfront, you should have these kind of questions listed here, and you should you should capture the responses for all that. Okay.
So these questions would be asked to whom?
To the subject matter.
To the customer.
Yes, the customer, right? So they will see. don't expect that the subject matter experts know what all requirements would the system need and he would tell you everything, right?
Right.
If you ask, he will tell you. He will know that, but he will not tell that comprehensively himself, right? So this framework would help you ask those right questions, right? So what all things you need to ask, and then what all details you need to get. So these 5 set of details would help you out. Okay. Now this is also called as a use case framework. We'll cover this detail when we're talking about the documentation, because we'll go back and then document this as part of our requirements specification, right? So use this framework for asking those questions and then getting those details. So if you are clear that you have all these details, then you can be pretty much sure that I have enough details to go and capture my requirements. Okay. So that's the approach you should take. So always keep this at the back of your mind, so this will give you a framework of what kind of questions I should ask, right? It gives you a structure to your requirements document, the way you're asking those questions, right? So mostly your structured interview, you'll have to go prepared for your questions, and broadly, focus on this framework for asking those right kind of questions, right? So these two are very frequent techniques, right? So almost every project you'll figure out what documents to read through, and then you read through them to understand that gain that first level of knowledge. Then you would have those one-on-one discussions with the subject matter experts. You would ask them questions, capture those responses, right? So this is also a very, very common technique. In almost all the projects will use these two techniques, right? We tend to use observation technique also wherever there is an existing process or system is in place. Why? Because it's always easier to see and then understand something rather than listen and understand, right? So you might have heard a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So the same applies for here as well. So rather than asking the SME and then he would explain this process flow, you could always ask him, can you please demonstrate it to me? Can you please show me how you do it currently? Right? A simple step. He would actually do that for you, and then you could just watch him and then see how is he capturing the details. Okay, just give me a minute. Yeah. So observation technique is nothing but asking him to demonstrate how he currently does it, and then taking notes of it. You're trying to understand it by watching how the person does. Now obviously this can be done when there is an existing process in place. Something like, let's say there is a process for customer registration. So you could say, how are you registering your customers now? It could be done manually, that there is a manual paper-based form that he would have to be filling in. Then he would perform some validations. You could watch that, or there could be some old mainframe-based system which you want to modify and then make it look better and do more efficiently. So you would use those observation technique to understand the process, right? Now this technique would not work if there is no existing process in place. For example, your mobile banking application. It's a completely new system, right? So there won't be any existing process. There is no existing funds transfer in a mobile app, right? So obviously, it might not work, right? So maybe you can use your online banking to understand the functionality and then convert it into mobile, but directly there is no mapping, that there is no functionality there, right? So you could come across some features which are new or first of its kind. There is no existing process. In those kind of situations, an observation technique would not work, right? So that's one main thing that you'll have to be aware. If it's a completely new thing, maybe the observation technique might not work. The other word of caution, if you just focus on the most popular way or the most common way of how things are done. Like, let's say there is a customer registration form, right? And as part of that, you will capture some n number of details. Let's say there are some 20 data points that you are capturing and some 5 documents that you are capturing, right? Now, most of the time when the customer is demonstrating, he will enter values which are everything is right, or he will submit the documents where everything is right, right? So you tend to only get this primary flow when you are going for your demonstrations, right? So he might skip out of all these alternate flows. So maybe, you know, what if one of these documents is not valid, if it's a fake document, or, you know, it's a forged document. So what should be the process flow, right? So unless you ask those questions, maybe, you know, the SME might not, you know, demonstrate it, right? So make sure that you ask those right questions, right, along with your observation. Even the customer is demonstrating it, you know, you should ask those questions and then check out those options. How should the system respond in case, you know, there is a deviation in the process, right? So those alternate flows are not coming out glaringly in your observation techniques or your demonstrations, right? So you need to be careful to ask those questions and you know, ensure that you get those details as well when you're doing observation techniques. So these are the 2 key things that you need to be aware of, right? Observation technique would not work where there is no existing process, and it would generally tend to focus on the most popular flows. And you know, it's your responsibility to ask those questions and get those additional details when you are using an observation technique, right? So broadly, there are 2 types of observation: active and passive. Active means the SME is dedicatedly demonstrating the product, the functionality to you, right? So he's only explaining the functionality just for you, right? So there is no other need for him to do that process. Just that, you know, you could understand the process. He's actually doing that process activity and then explaining it in detail to you, right? In some scenarios where you want to make it more efficient, maybe you just want to observe him from a distance and do not disturb him, right? So you want to see, you know, how he is doing currently, where exactly, you know, you find problems with the process, or you know, you try to figure out what exactly are the limitations of the system. You could go in for a passive observation. A passive observation means that, you know, you are not asking the SME to explain the process to you, right? He is doing his job, and then you are observing him from a distance. You are not even disturbing him with the questions at that point. Now, why do we need to do that? There are 2 main reasons. One, in some cases, maybe, you know, the SME could be really tied up with his operational work. Now, most of your SMEs are not there dedicatedly to help you with their requirements. So they do their day jobs also, right? So they do their operations job, and they take this additional responsibility for these requirements. So in those kind of situations, what you could do is, you could say, you know what, you do your job, let me watch you for some time, so that will give me first level of knowledge, and then we can have a discussion, small discussion, to close out on my questions. So that way we'll save our time. We don't have to spend the whole 1-2 hours, maybe, you know, 15-20 minutes, we could close out on all questions, and then, so this way you're saving both their time, right? But this rarely happens. Whenever somebody is actually assigned to a project, they are dedicatedly given. So rarely you would get into these kind of situations. But in case where, you know, the SME is hard pressed for time, you could always use this option. You could go for a passive observation, and then you know, ask him to continue with his job, and then you would watch him and understand the requirement, right? Now, the second reason where you could go for a passive observation is, you want to understand where exactly is the customer getting stuck, right? If they, you know, if you want to figure out, you know, is there any point where this guy is getting into unnecessary activities, or can I improve this process? So you want to figure out that behavior of that person using the system, right? From a usability point of view, you tend to go for these passive observations, right? You will figure out, some of the information might not be very clearly coming out on your screens. So the customers might be, the SME might be looking at that and then thinking through, or you might spend a lot more time on that, filling in some data, right? You could take those inputs and then try to optimize it. You can make it look much more efficient and faster by using those inputs, right? So use observation technique, judiciously, right? So wherever possible, you should go for the observation technique, right? So if the customer could actually help you out by demonstrating something, ask for it, because that way you understand the requirement much better than just listening to the person's requirement, right? It will reduce the disconnect also. So if you are watching something, it's easier for you to understand, and compared to just somebody explaining you could interpret it in a completely different way. To reduce all those disconnects, go for an observation technique wherever possible, right? Now broadly, these three techniques would give you enough information about the requirement, right? Most of the times we tend to use these techniques. These three techniques are most widely used, right? You first read some documents, get that basic understanding, then you go prepared with the list of questions. You understand those requirements by asking those questions, and then capture the details. Then wherever possible, you will ask the customer to demonstrate that particular requirement, and then capture the details, right? You would understand the requirements in that way, right? Most frequently used techniques are these three. Okay. Now, what happens is, a lot of times you capture the requirements, you understand the requirement rather, right? So the customer tells you something, and then you understand the requirement. Okay. Now the customer might be expecting something, right? So you must be expecting something like this, and you understood it like this, let's say, right? Now the customer says, there should be a way for the person to sit. You think, okay, there is a place to sit, and then the customer says, should be able to swing. Even this would swing. So you think that the customer would, the requirement was met, right? And you think that this would be okay with the customer. The customer would think that you would give me the product exactly which looks like this, because this is what you are looking at, right? Now there is a disconnect. If you see, the customer wants something, you are delivering something else, right? Now when does this come up? Usually it comes up during testing, right? So you will take the requirement, you would design and develop it, and then you will take it to the customer and then say, what, I have developed the product, now you test it. The customer would say, what, this is not what I was expecting. So when is this identified? This is identified during the testing phase. Not a good thing to do. Why? Because you have wasted a lot of time in designing, and you wasted a lot of time in your design and development, and now the customer says that he doesn't like it. What should you do? Right? So it's a waste of time, right? So there is a disconnect. We should have plugged that disconnect right at the requirements phase rather than at the testing time, right? So it makes sense to fix those disconnects in your both your understandings right at the start. Now, how can we plug those disconnects? We can do that by prototyping, right? So we can exactly create those wireframes or mock-up screens, which would basically say that, this is how your screen would look like, right? And this is exactly what you can expect as your final product, right? So that's called as prototyping. Now the advantage of this is, both of you would understand it either this way or this way. So, the customer is clear that I'm going to get, let's say you're going to get this. So the customer knows that he's going to get this. You also know that you have to deliver this. The technical team also knows that you have to deliver this, right? So how do we get to that stage? By creating prototypes, right? Now prototype is nothing but a screen or a view of the screen, which basically tells how your final product would look like. So maybe something like this, right? So it could be as simple as that you're drawing a screen sketch and then explaining that your screen would look like this, right? So this is the most primitive type of prototype, right? And it can be done very easily. You can just draw it and then say explain how it looks like. And more or less, when you deliver your final product, the customer should be happy because he knows that broadly this is the layout of the screen. This is where the video occurs. This is where the suggestions would come in. This is where the social media integration comes in, and this is where the comments comes in. Right? So more or less you would be aligned to this. Both of them are aligned to the final way in which the screen should look like. Okay. So prototypes bring in that clarity, right? So both you guys would understand it in the same way. Okay. So that's the advantage of the prototype. Okay. So wherever possible, you should create those prototypes. So the typical process would be you would first understand the requirements. You would have those one-on-one discussions, and use observation technique wherever possible to get more details about it. And then you would validate that understanding by drawing prototypes. Okay, so close to 70-80% of your project, you generally requirements you would capture using these techniques, very common techniques. Now I'll give you a little more details about the prototyping, but yeah, I hope the overall process in which we should approach is clear to you guys. Any questions? Let's take a quick checkpoint here before I move ahead with the prototyping. Just wanted to make sure that you're clear with this, the way you should approach your requirements. What kind of questions to ask? How do you get those first level of knowledge? How would you enhance it by asking what kind of questions? How to leverage an observation technique? Is this clear? Anything which you want me
to create a mock-up like a...
Right. So see, the most easiest one is use a pen and paper and then sketch it. It could be as simple as that. Now there are some softwares where we can actually create mock-up screens. Then you could actually create the screen. So something like if you have a HTML developer, right? You could actually use that person to develop the screen, right? So this is the nearest you could get to a prototype and the final version, right? So if you actually create this as a prototype, right? So there won't be any disconnect between you and the customer. It's as good as your final product, right? Except that it won't have the underlying functionality. Only the screen view is what is created as part of this prototype, right? So it could vary from a basic sketch which you're drawing using a pen and paper. It could come in somewhere in between, wherein you would use some software to create the wireframes. It could be your near final version, wherein you would use a developer to develop your screens, right? So that differs. It differs from context to context, project to project. Depends on the level of clarity you want. So that's primarily a business analyst decision. So I wouldn't say you always have to create this prototype for all the projects. Neither I would say you just stick to the basic prototypes. So you will have to evaluate that situation, and wherever you feel I need that exact clarity on how the screen should look like, you go for this kind of version. If a broad indication is good enough, you'll go for this kind of prototypes. So it depends. So there is no one single answer for that kind of question. Okay. So again, see, drawing this prototype is not a big deal, right? So the easiest, simplest one is this. Then you have so many on you know in the you know you have so many tutorials available, right? So the basic one is what you sketch, right? So then you have some softwares like maybe this ML Webco is one software, right? There's so many softwares like that, like Lynda is another one, right? HTML Toronto is another one, right? So there are multiple types of prototyping software, right? And you don't need to be an expert in all of that. So there are some people who are experts in usability, so it's their responsibility to draw the wireframes. Right? So you would broadly get that indication, and then you would engage this usability guy to create those screens. Worst case scenario, you will have to learn the software, and I would say it would take you maybe an hour or 2 hours to understand that one. So not a big deal. Just that we need to be aware of that there are some wireframe softwares which you can use, and since they are so widely or so different type of wireframe softwares available, there is no point covering all of them in this course, right? So you can learn it on your own. It's not so complicated thing. But what I would spend on is the various types of prototyping and how would you engage your SME to go through this prototyping session. So broadly, there are some classifications of prototyping and all, which I would cover. Yeah, but are you clear with this? The overall way in which we would have approached our requirements. Now, do you get a sense of how to approach a requirement, right? So it should not, at least if I'm asked to capture the requirement about a customer registration, right? So what's the first thing that I would do? And then maybe I'll go and ask for some documents. Show me your current customer registration form. I'll try to understand those process. Then I'll go prepared with the list of questions that I should go with, and then ask questions for that. So broadly, you have that framework of primary flow, alternate flows, prerequisites, notifications, and then your exception flows. All those would kind of details you would capture by asking those questions. You'll figure out all of that, and then maybe if there is a current manual process in which they're capturing the doing the customer registration, you could figure that out by going for an observation technique, right? So broadly, you get a sense of how to understand the requirement, right? Now, once you understood the requirement, you have to ensure that you and the customer are clear about how the final system would look like. There should not be any disconnect. To reduce those disconnects, we'll use prototyping. Yeah, prototyping and the rest of the techniques we'll take in the following sessions. But yeah,
I would like to just let us just have a brief summary of today's class.
Okay. So quickly, yeah, I think that's a good way to end the session. Now, once you have done with the planning, right? So you'd have a detailed project plan coming out, and you have the work breakdown structure also. On this particular day, I'm going to capture this requirement, right? So, how would you approach capturing the detailed requirements for that? Now, for most of the requirements, you'll follow these 3 steps, right? So this 3-step process, where first step you would read some documents and then gain that first level of knowledge, right? So I would suggest you should ask for these documents right the moment you know what project you are getting into, right? So don't wait till all your project planning is completed and everything is completed and then say first 3 days I'll, right? The moment you are onboarded onto your project, daily spend some time to understand what the requirement is about, right? So there are multiple sources of information, right? So you could even search on internet, you could ask for some process documents within the organization, you could look at your competitor products, you could look at regulatory websites, you could look at the existing way the systems are, the current systems are working, you could look at some customer suggestion log, excuse me. You could figure out all those documents and read through them. So it would vary from project to project depending on the project type. The kind of documentation available will also be different. So you need to figure out what documents are relevant and then read that documents to get that first level of understanding, right? Then, each requirement, when you go for your requirement elicitation, as per that work breakdown structure, what you have prepared, you go prepared with a list of questions, right? So what kind of questions to ask? I introduce you to a broad framework. You focus on the process flow, then, what are all the alternate flows, check out for those prerequisites, check out for those notifications, and then check out for those exception conditions where something fails. Right? So broadly, this will cover you the most kind of questions that you want to cover. Right? Also, any non-functional requirements, like is there any performance requirements or security requirements, right? So these are all your non-functional requirements. You should ask about those non-functional requirements as well. Right? So more about what kind of non-functional requirements would come in, I'll explain you about that. Later when we look at the requirements documentation. Okay. So broadly, that is what we looked at. Now, once we understand the requirement, the next step, what we generally do is we would make sure that the customer also understands it in the same way, right? So how do we do that? We do that using prototyping, right? So basically, we are creating some screens, and then we are saying that here this is how your final screens would look like, and the customer also can clearly understand that your final screens would look like this. So both of them agree onto this, agree to this way. Okay. I hope that gives you that a summary view of what you have to do for most of the requirements. Now there are some techniques like focus groups and then reverse engineering workshops and all. They are relevant only under specific context and specific scenarios, circumstances. So we will understand where they would be relevant and all in the following sessions. But for most of your requirements, this is what you would follow. You would read some documents to get the first level of understanding. You would interview the SMEs, ask those questions and get the responses. And then wherever possible, you would get into a demonstration and then understand the requirements. And finally, you would validate your understanding by prototyping, creating the prototypes or the wireframes and all. Okay? Right. So again, the next 1-2 sessions all would be a little more theoretical, because it's very qualitative, I would say, right? So unless you, it's more like you are trying to understand the process. So there is no definite guidance or some definite framework which would come in. They are more soft skills, I would say, which will help you understand the requirements better.